The ship was dying and everyone on it knew it. Not the dramatic kind of dying. Not fire and explosions and hull breaches. Those were almost kinder because they were fast. This was the slow kind, the quiet kind. The kind where the lights stay on but the air gets thin, and the recyclers make a sound like a tired old machine deciding it has had enough. And the 4,000 people in the lower decks start moving less because moving costs oxygen, and oxygen is the one thing they are running out of. The Kikulate, Athon's Grace, had been a colony ship for 60 years. She had crossed 17 star systems, survived 2 ion storms, and carried the Velthari people across distances that would have broken younger vessels. She was not a young vessel anymore. She was old in the way that only ships get old, tired in the hull, tired in the joints, tired in the parts that nobody thinks about until they stop working. They had stopped working 3 days ago. Elder Navigator Sorveon stood at the center of the command bridge and looked at the readouts and said nothing for a very long time. The officers around him said nothing either. That was the Velthari way. Silence before speech, stillness before movement. Consider everything, then act with precision. The gravitational dead zone around the collapsed star was the problem. Not an unusual dead zone, they existed throughout the outer rim. Places where the fabric of space had been stretched and warped by the death of something massive, where engines behaved badly and navigation systems read wrong, and drift became the only direction a ship knew how to go. The Athon's Grace had drifted into one. The engines had tried to correct. Then the engines had simply given up. The oxygen recyclers followed shortly after. Sorvan was 340 years old. By Velthari reckoning, he was in the middle of his life. Not young, not yet old. Somewhere in the long flat country between the two. He had navigated ships for 290 of those years. He had seen disasters. He had solved them, or he had found ways around them, or he had found ways to endure them. He had never once, in 290 years, sent a distress signal. The Velthari did not send distress signals. It was not a law. There was no rule written anywhere that said the Velthari could not ask for help. It was something older than law. It was something in the bone. The Velthari were an old species, older than most of the ones they shared the galaxy with, and they had built their civilization on a very simple idea. You handled your own problems. You solved what needed solving. You did not put your trouble on someone else's shoulders and call it dignity. They had diplomatic relationships with 12 other species. They had trade agreements, border treaties, mutual defense pacts. What they did not have was a history of need, of asking, of saying, "We cannot do this without you." Sorvan looked at the oxygen readouts again. 14 hours, maybe 16 if they cut power to the lower decks and moved the people into the upper sections. But that would cause panic, and panic used oxygen faster than stillness, so perhaps not. 4,000 people. He turned to his communications officer. She was young, barely past her first century, which by Velthari standards made her practically a child on the bridge. Her name was Vane, and she had been watching him for the last hour. With an expression she was trying very hard to keep neutral and not quite managing. "The Galactic Emergency Band," Sorvan said. Vane did not move for a moment. She understood what he was saying. Every species in the known galaxy monitored that frequency. It was the one channel that everyone agreed on. The only piece of electromagnetic spectrum that had something like consensus behind it. You listened to it. You responded to it. That was the agreement. That was what it was for. The Velthari had never used it, not once. "Elder Navigator," Vane said carefully. "Are you authorizing 4,000 people?" Sorvan said. That was all. Vane turned back to her console. Her hands moved. The signal went out. A standard distress packet, compressed and encoded, carrying Athon's Grace. His position, the nature of the emergency, the number of souls on board, and one word at the end that Sorvan had added himself because he felt it was necessary even though it was not standard protocol. "Please." He stood at the center of the bridge and waited. The Velthari did not expect fast responses. Space was large. The outer rim was sparsely traveled. The nearest known shipping lane was several hours out even at top speed. He calculated that if any ship responded, the response would come in 6 to 8 hours. If they were lucky, if anyone was close enough, if anyone was willing to divert, he was prepared to wait. The response came in 11 minutes. Vane turned in her chair and looked at him with an expression he had never seen on a Velthari face before. Something between shock and something she didn't have a word for. "Elder Navigator," she said, "we have a response." Sorvan moved to her console. "Read the incoming signal. Read it again." It was not a government response, not a fleet, not a patrol vessel or a medical ship or a diplomatic carrier. It was a cargo freighter. Human registered, out of a refinery run in the mid-rim. The P- Martagine, a small ship, by any standard. One of those battered human working vessels that carried industrial goods between stations and didn't look like much from the outside and probably didn't look like much from the inside either. The message was 9 words. Copy that, we're coming. Hold on, Captain Diosi. Sir Vaughn read it a third time. Hold on, he said out loud, because the phrase did not translate cleanly. In the Velthari language, there were specific phrases for waiting, for endurance, for the maintenance of position. Hold on was none of those things. It was informal. It was almost careless in its directness, like the captain had not stopped to compose her words because there wasn't time, and also because the words didn't matter as much as the doing. Hold on. What does that mean? He asked. Nobody answered. The bridge officers looked at each other, and then at the message, and then at their navigation. Readouts showing the Martajan. His last known position, calculating the distance, calculating the time. Then Vane said it, quietly, half to herself. I think she means don't die. Sorvan looked at the message for another long moment. 9 words from a cargo captain who had apparently read a distress signal and simply turned around. Without calculation, without negotiation, without asking what was in it for her, or what the salvage rates were on Velthari colony, ships, or whether the Velthari government would compensate her for her time. We're coming. Not. We'll try. Not. Stand by while we assess. Not. We are currently reviewing your request. We're coming. He stood there and felt something he didn't have a precise name for. It was not gratitude, that would come later, maybe, if this worked. It was something more immediate. Something almost like the feeling you got when you were falling, and something solid caught you. The surprise of the catching. The sudden understanding that the ground was not as far away as you thought. More responses came in over the next 2 hours. A second human cargo vessel, Port Remy, coming from the other direction, closer but smaller, with less capacity. A human Earth Navy patrol cutter called the ESN Kessler, which had been on a routine sweep of the outer rim, and had apparently changed course the moment the signal hit. And a private medical frigate, human registered, called the St. Agatha, which operated out of Luna Station and had no business being this far out but was here anyway and was coming. 4 ships. 4 human ships. No one else responded. Sorvan went through the data on every species that monitored the Galactic Emergency Band. There were 9 of them with vessels anywhere near this sector. He could see from the signal logs that the distress packet had been received by all of them. Communications traffic showed deliberations, calculations. The Keth sent a response to their central command asking for authorization. The Praxen fleet acknowledged receipt and logged the call. The Duran Cooperative's nearest vessel sent a query back asking for clarification on the nature of the emergency. The humans had just come. He pulled the data on the Martajan. She was 9 hours out at standard speed. She was not traveling at standard speed. Her engine output readings were, he checked the number twice, 140% of rated capacity. That was not a sustainable speed. That was the kind of speed that broke engines. She was braking her engine to get there faster. He stood at the viewport and looked out at the dead zone. The strange, flat, empty quality of space around a collapsed star, where even light seemed to behave like it was tired. Athen's grace drifted in the silence of it. Somewhere behind him he could hear the recyclers cycling down, doing their slow accounting of what was left. 4. Zuzan people below decks. He thought about the 600 years of Velthari spaceflight, the pride of it, the independence of it, the long, clean history of a species that solved its own problems and needed nothing from anyone. He thought about 3 words from a cargo captain he had never met. We're coming. In the lower decks, a child pressed her face against a porthole and watched the stars and knew something was wrong, because children always know when something is wrong, and they feel it in the stomach before anyone tells them. She didn't know about the oxygen readouts or the recycler failure, or the 11-minute response, or the 4 ships burning hard through the dark toward them. She knew the ship was very quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. She put her hand on the porthole glass, cold under her fingers. Somewhere out there, a human woman was pushing her engine past the point of safety to reach her. The child didn't know that yet. She was just afraid, the way children are afraid, completely, without armor, with the whole weight of it. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and waited. A Ethan's grace. Drifted. The Marta Jean came. Sorvan went back to his chair and did the one thing he had never done in 290 years of navigation. He waited for someone else to save them. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Not because he was ashamed. The shame had burned off somewhere in the 11 minutes between the signal and the response. It was hard because it required a kind of trust he had never practiced. A trust that was not in a calculation or a system or a known quantity. A trust in a stranger who was breaking her engine in the dark because someone called. Van was watching him again with that expression. They will get here, she said. She said it like she believed it. Sorvan looked at the readouts. 14 hours of oxygen, 9 hours for the Marta Jean. If her engine held. The math worked, barely. With humans, he was beginning to understand it was always barely. They always arrived in the last window. Not because they were slow, but because they were always already doing something else when you needed them. Always mid-cargo run, mid-patrol, mid-nothing in particular. And they came anyway. And they got there in time because they chose the window where it was still possible. And then they pushed every system they had to fit inside it. He did not understand them. He thought he might be starting to. Outside, the collapsed star at the center of the dead zone pulsed with the dim, heavy light of something that had once been enormous and was now something else entirely. Space around the Ethan's grace stayed flat and strange and very quiet. 9 hours. Sorvan sat in his chair and he waited. And in 290 years of navigation, it was the first time waiting had felt like something other than patience. It felt like being caught. Tomas Reyes had a system. It was not a complicated system. It was not written down anywhere or explained to anyone. It was just the way he worked. And it went like this. When something was wrong with the Marta Jean, he fixed it. When something was going to go wrong, he fixed that first. When something could not be fixed, he swore at it in 3 languages and then fixed it anyway. In 8 years of flying with Dara Ose, the system had worked every time. He was in the engine bay when the call came through. Not because anything was broken. He was there because the number 3 coolant pump had been making a sound he didn't like for the past 4 days, a small whistling sound that meant nothing yet, but would mean something eventually, and he believed in meeting problems before they fully became problems. He had his sleeve rolled up to the elbow, and his hands inside the casing when Dara's voice came through the ship wide. Crew to the bridge. The tone of her voice was the tone that meant this was not a drill and also not optional. He wiped his hands and went. Prianair was already on the bridge when he got there, which meant she had been at her navigation console the whole time and had probably heard the distress signal before Dara did. Priya usually had. She had a habit of listening to frequencies that most pilots only checked once in a while. She said it was professional diligence. Tomas thought it was because she was constitutionally incapable of minding her own business, which he meant with complete respect. Kwame Asante came in behind him. Their medic, their moral compass, the person on the ship who made everyone feel slightly better about humanity just by existing. He had a cup of something in his hand, and he looked calm in the way that Kwame always looked calm, which was the kind of calm that was not the absence of concern but the decision to handle concern in an orderly fashion. Dara pulled up the signal on the main screen. She let them read it. She didn't explain it. Dara Ose was economical with explanations the way some people were economical with money. Not because she was stingy, but because she had learned that most things explain themselves if you looked at them long enough. The signal was a Velthari colony ship, the Ethan's Grace. Outer rim in a gravitational dead zone around a collapsed star. Engines dead. Oxygen recyclers failing. Estimated 14 hours of breathable air for 4. Zeros and souls on board, 14 hours. Tomas did the math. They were 9 hours out at current speed. 2-hour buffer, give or take. Then he pulled up the engine specs in his head. Not because he needed to. He had them memorized the way other people had phone numbers. And he did a different kind of math. Not the comfortable kind. How fast are we going? He asked. Standard, Dara said, and if we go faster, we get there with a 4-hour buffer. At what engine output? Dara looked at him steadily. 140. Tomas looked back at her steadily. 140% of rated capacity was the kind of number that made engines go from tired to broken. The Marta Jean main drive was already 18 years old. It had been maintained perfectly. He maintained it perfectly. That was the system, but perfection had limits and 140% was outside them. Okay, he said. He said it the way you say something when you've already decided, and the saying of it is just the paperwork. We need to dump the cargo, Priya said from her console. She had not looked up. She was already running the rerouting calculations. Yes, Dara said. That's our contract. Tomas said. The whole contract. 2 million in industrial polymers. They're not going to pay us for cargo we spaced. Invoke them later, Dara said. And that was the conversation. That was the entirety of the business discussion. Tomas looked at Kwame, who was drinking his cup of whatever, and nodding slowly. He looked at Priya, who was already filing the course correction. He went back to the engine bay. The cargo went out in 3 minutes. He heard the airlock cycling from below. 2,000 crates of industrial polymer, tumbling out into the dark of the outer rim, useful to no one but the stars. He did not watch it go. He was already reconfiguring the engine output, talking to the drive system the way you talk to something old and tired that you are asking for one more big thing. I know, he said out loud. To no one, to the engine. I know. One more time, he pushed the output to 140%. Marta Jean shuddered. She was not a young ship. She had been built in a shipyard in Sao Paulo orbit, back when Earth was still sorting out its second space program, back when ships were built to last rather than built to spec. She had that quality. She was solid in her bones even when she was questionable in her joints. The shudder settled into a deep, full vibration that Tomas felt in his back teeth, and then the ship leveled out and moved, really moved, in a way she normally didn't. He stood in the engine bay and listened to her, and talked to her and watched the readouts and kept her alive. Up on the bridge, Dara Ose set a course and flew it. She did not explain to the crew why she had made this decision in 11 seconds flat. She did not tell them about her brother. She did not tell them about the 7-year-old distress call that had gone out from a colony runner in the mid-rim, a ship called Decatur's Hope, which had been carrying 300 people, including her younger brother Marcus, who had been 24 years old, and wanted to work in agricultural development on one of the outer colonies and had been 6 weeks from arriving when something had gone wrong with the ship's navigation system. 3 ships had been within range. None of them had diverted. Decatur's Hope had drifted for 31 hours before a survey vessel had stumbled across it by accident. By then, she did not think about that. She did not keep that memory anywhere close to the surface, because the surface was where she needed to be to fly, and flying required the kind of attention that grief could not share space with. She kept it sealed, compressed, tucked into a corner of herself that she visited rarely and always at her own choosing. And right now, she was not choosing to visit it. She was choosing to fly. Priya looked over at her from the navigation console, just a glance. She had known Dara for 5 years and she knew better than to say anything. She just ran the calculations and made sure they were right. Hour 2. Marta Jean was singing with the effort, not a bad sound, just a working sound. The sound of something doing more than it was designed to do and doing it anyway, because the hands on the controls were asking it to. Tomas sent up a status report every 20 minutes. The coolant pump he'd been worried about was holding. The number 2 fuel injector was running warm. He had solutions for both. Our 4. Kwame had set up the medical supplies in the forward cargo bay, which was now empty and cold and smelled like polymer resin. He had 5 med kits, a portable defibrillator, 2 oxygen concentrators that were technically rated for human physiology, but were adjustable, 3 units of synthetic plasma that probably wouldn't work on Velthari biology but might, and a reference file on Velthari anatomy that he had pulled from the ship's database, and was reading with the focused attention of a man who understood that he would be working outside his training in a few hours, and intended to be as ready as he could be. The Velthari were not that different physiologically. Carbon-based, oxygen-dependent, bilateral symmetry, circulatory system that ran on something close enough to blood that the plasma might matter after all. He made a note. Hour 6. Dara was alone on the bridge. The others had gone to eat, rest, prepare. She sat in the captain's chair with the course locked in, and the autopilot managing the minor corrections and her hands resting on her knees. She pulled up the personal console beside the captain's chair, opened her private files. There was one labeled with a date, 7 years ago, and a name. Marcus. She looked at it. She did not open it. She just looked at it the way you look at something that you carry everywhere and never fully look at. Then she closed the console and sat in the dark and flew her ship. Hour 8. The other human vessels had checked in. The Tobre, Port Remy, a cargo hauler not much bigger than the Marta Jean, was coming from a different vector, about 40 minutes behind them. The ESN Kessler, a patrol cutter out of the Earth Navy, was running intercept from the south and would arrive roughly concurrent. The St. Agatha. The medical frigate was further out but fast. She'd be there within an hour of the Marta Jean. Dara had not spoken to any of them except to acknowledge their responses and share positioning data. There was no plan to coordinate. There were no assigned roles. She was a cargo captain, not a fleet officer, and she had no authority over any of the other ships. They were just all going, each one doing the thing they could do when they got there. Priya had a theory about this that she shared with Kwame during dinner. "We don't have a coordination protocol," she said, "because we don't need one. Everyone knows what to do when someone needs help. You go to the need. You do what you can do. You trust the other people to do what they can do." Kwame considered this. The Velthari don't have that. A lot of species don't. Why do we? Priya thought about it. She ate some of her food. She thought about it more. "I don't know," she said finally. "I think it's because we spent a long time being the species that needed help. Early on. Before we figured things out. We were really good at needing help." Kwame smiled at that. It was a specific kind of human smile, the kind that knows something about pain and hasn't let the pain make it mean. "Maybe that's it," he said. Hour 9. Tomas came up from the engine bay for the first time since hour 1. He was covered in coolant, and his hands were black to the elbow and he smelled terrible. He poured himself a coffee from the galley, drank half of it standing up, and then went directly back to the engine bay without sitting down. "How's she doing?" Dara called after him. "Ask me in an hour," he called back. She took that as good news. Marta Jean pressed forward through the dark. Outside, the stars of the outer rim were sparse and scattered, the kind of sky that made you feel like you were at the edge of something. Which they were. The gravitational dead zone was on the sensors now, a soft blurring on the edges of the navigation display, the place where things went strange and engines behaved badly and 4,000 people were waiting in thinning air. Dara opened a channel to the Athon's Grace. Marta Jean. 2. Athon's Grace. We are 1 hour out. Current approach from bearing 227 Mark 14. Please confirm you can receive docking approach from that vector. There was a pause, longer than she expected. She imagined the aliens on the other end, the Velthari, old species, 600 years of spaceflight, apparently no history of asking for help, receiving a call from a battered human freighter that was 1 hour away. A voice came back, not young, deep, measured, with the careful pronunciation of someone speaking a language they had learned from text rather than from childhood. "This is Elder Navigator Sorvan of the Ethan's Grace. Confirmed. Marta Jean. Bearing 227 Mark 14 is viable. We are grateful." Grateful. Came out slightly stiff, like it was a word the voice knew but had not said often. Dara understood that. She knew what it cost to say a word you hadn't practiced. "We'll be there," she said. "Hold on." She used the phrase again without thinking. The same 9 words she'd sent back at the start. The phrase that apparently didn't translate cleanly, that the Velthari navigator had read and not understood. Hold on. She meant don't stop. She meant we are coming and the coming matters. She meant the distance between you and safe is shrinking and every second that passes we are closer and you are not alone. She meant my brother's name was Marcus and he was 24 years old and nobody came and I am here and I am coming and I will not be late. She did not say any of that. She flew her ship 1 hour. The dead zone looked like nothing. That was the thing about them that nobody told you until you were inside one. You expected something visual, some shimmer, some distortion, some sign that the space around you was behaving badly, but there was nothing, just regular stars, regular dark. The only way you knew was the instruments, which argued with each other in the specific way that instruments argued when the rules they were designed to follow were being quietly broken. Dara flew by feel for the last 20 minutes. Not literally, she was watching the screens. But she had been flying long enough that she trusted the small wrongnesses she felt in the controls, more than she trusted the numbers, and the small wrongnesses were telling her things the numbers couldn't. The Marta Jean wanted to drift slightly left. The engine feedback had a lag that didn't belong there. The gravitational curve was doing something that the navigation computer was interpreting as 3 different things at once. She corrected for all of it. She did not look stressed. She looked the way she always looked when she was working, which was the way a person looks when they are doing the thing they were made for. Very still on the outside, very busy underneath. "Got her on visual," Priya said. Ethan's Grace appeared on the forward screen. She was big. Bigger than Dara had expected, a long, sweeping vessel built in the Velthari style, which meant curves where human ships had angles and a certain organic quality that made her look grown rather than built. She would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Right now she was dark in the places where she should have been lit, and her running lights had the dim, uncertain quality of a ship on minimum power, and she was drifting in the slow, unhurried way of something that had stopped being able to choose its direction. Oxygen readouts from her hull sensors, Priya said quietly. They've got maybe 6 hours left, maybe less. We're here, Dara said. Let's go. The docking approach took 19 minutes. 19 minutes of very careful flying through a gravitational field that kept changing its mind, approaching a ship whose docking systems were running on backup power and whose airlock responses were slow and uncertain. Priya talked her through every meter. Tomas had come up from the engine bay and stood behind Dara's chair without being asked, watching the screens, not saying anything, which was more useful than most things people said. Marta Jean, locked to the Neri. Athon's Grace. With a clunk that echoed through both ships. All right, Dara said. She stood up. Quam with me, Tomas. You're on the engine assessment. I need to know what they need and whether we have it. Priya, stay on comms and keep the Kessler and Port Remy updated. She was already moving toward the airlock as she said it. She had her EVA suit on, patched at the left elbow, scratched across the visor from an incident she preferred not to explain, functional in every way that mattered. She had an oxygen line connector in her right hand and a toolbox in her left, and she had Kwame behind her with a med kit over each shoulder. The inner airlock door on the Athens Grace slid open. 6 Velthari guards stood on the other side of it. They were tall. Not remarkably tall. Dara was average human height, and they had maybe 15 centimeters on her. But the suits they wore and the way they stood made them seem larger, and the weapons they were holding were raised and pointed at her in a way that was professional and deliberate, and not especially welcoming. Dara stopped, looked at the weapons, looked at the guards. She had been in situations before where weapons were pointed at her. She had a range of responses she had developed over the years for this exact circumstance. The first response was internal and lasted about 2 seconds and involved something in the chest. The second response was external and was the one she used. She did not raise her hands. She did not back up. She held up the oxygen line connector. Where's your main recycler? She said. We don't have a lot of time. There was a long pause. One of the guards looked at another guard. The other guard looked at something to the side, a panel or a camera, or some place where a decision was being made. Dara did not look at any of that. She kept her eyes on the oxygen connector and her expression on the matter at hand. A voice came through the ship's internal speaker, the same deep, measured voice she'd spoken to from the bridge. Stand down. The weapons came down. Not fast, slowly, with the deliberate quality of a decision being made carefully, but they came down. Dara walked through them. She didn't brush past them, or make a show of it. She just walked through the space between them in the direction of the ship's interior, because standing in the airlock was not useful. Main recycler, she said again to whoever was listening. A guard, the one on the left, who was looking at her with the specific expression of someone trying to categorize a thing they had no category for, turned and led her deeper into the ship. Sorvan watched from the command bridge on the monitor. The human woman walked through his security detail like they were furniture, not aggressively, not dismissively, just purposefully, like their weapons were an inconvenience that she had assessed and moved past, the way you move past a puddle on the floor. He had briefed his guards before the docking. These are humans, they can be erratic, be cautious. He had expected them to be cautious. She had walked right through them. He took the corridor down to the recycler bay himself. He needed to see this. The main recycler was in a room that smelled of something burning, and something chemical, and something organic, in a way that meant the machines were losing. The room was not large, but it was complicated. Velthari engineering favored layered systems that were redundant and beautiful, and did not respond well to improvisation. 3 of his own engineers had been working on it for 2 days, and had reached the conclusion that the core coupling was shattered beyond what they could repair with the parts they had. The human woman looked at it for about 30 seconds. Then she opened her toolbox. What followed was, by the standards of any Velthari engineering manual, completely wrong. She used connectors that were not rated for the coupling. She bypassed 2 redundancy systems in a way that made Sorvan's senior engineer physically wince. She used sealant from a tube that had a human manufacturer's label on it, and that was clearly designed for a different type of joint entirely. She was talking the whole time, not to him, not to anyone specifically, just talking, short, practical sentences that were partly instructions to Kwame, and partly things she was thinking out loud, and partly what sounded like a running argument with the machine itself. You're fine. This is fine. This is not how this is supposed to work, but this is how it's going to work, okay? Kwame, hand me the yes. Okay, I think, hold this. Kwame held things. He passed tools. He occasionally said, "Are you sure?" in a tone that suggested he was not sure, and she said yes in a tone that suggested she was, and he handed her the next tool. She finished in 40 minutes. The recycler came back on with a sound like something remembering how to breathe. The senior Velthari engineer stood in the doorway, looking at the repair, with the expression of a person who has just watched a building be constructed entirely out of the wrong materials and is presently watching it stand up and not fall over. He was doing the calculation. He was trying to work out by what principle any of what she had done should have worked. Sorvan was watching the oxygen readouts. They had stopped falling. They had started, slowly, cautiously, to climb. He looked at the human woman. She was on one knee on the floor packing tools back into her toolbox. Her suit was marked with Velthari coolant and something that might have been recycler fluid, and she had a smear of something across her visor. "Elder Navigator," she said without looking up. She had apparently figured out who he was. "Your power coupling on the secondary grid is running at about 60%. That's your next problem. My engineer can look at it. He's better with power systems than I am." Sorvan looked at her. Then he looked at his senior engineer, who gave him the smallest nod, which meant, "She is right about the power coupling." "Yes," Sorvan said, "please." E.S.N. Kessler. Docked 20 minutes later, and the thing about having a naval patrol cutter arrive was that it had actual damage control teams, and those teams moved through the Ethan's grace with a kind of organized efficiency that came from training specifically for this. They split into groups. One group went to the power systems. One group went to the lower decks where the worst oxygen depletion had been. One went to the engine bay. Port Remy came in behind them and wasn't large enough to dock, so she maneuvered alongside and ran oxygen lines across the gap. Actual physical lines, connected through a retrofitted port that the Port Remy, his captain, had apparently been carrying in his emergency kit for reasons that were unclear, and that Sorvan had stopped trying to understand. The Branker, St. Agatha, arrived 40 minutes after that. She sent over a medical team of 4. Nobody coordinated any of this. There was no command structure. The human ships talked to each other on an open channel, and whoever heard a need filled it. The naval team and the Marta Jean, his engineer Tomas, who had arrived in the power coupling room exactly when predicted, argued loudly and productively about the correct repair approach for 20 minutes and then fixed it in the method that was a combination of both approaches. Sorvan walked the ship. He had not done this during the crisis. There had been no reason and no time, and in a crisis a navigator stayed at the nav station. But now, with the oxygen climbing and the power stabilizing, and the repair teams moving through the corridors, he walked. He needed to see. In the 4th corridor of the lower decks, he found Tomas Reyes crouching in front of a small Velthari child, a girl, very young, barely past her first decade, who was sitting on a wall bench and watching him with enormous eyes. Tomas was talking. "So the coupling is like, imagine you've got 2 cups, and you're pouring water from one to the other, but someone knocked the cup sideways. So you're just pouring water onto the floor, and the water is electricity and the floor is sep." He noticed Sorvan and looked up. "Oh, hi, is this okay?" "She found me. I can go," the child said something in Velthari. Sorvan translated it automatically. "He explains things." "She is saying you explain things," Sorvan said. "I explain things," Tomas confirmed. "It's kind of a problem, actually. My captain always tells me to talk less. I can't, I've tried." He turned back to the child. "Okay, so the electricity is going across the floor, which is bad for the electricity." Sorvan stood in the corridor and watched a human engineer explain electrical systems to a Velthari child with complete, undivided attention, as if there were nothing more important happening in the universe at this moment, as if the fact that she was a different species, and he had been awake for over 20 hours, and there was still work to be done on the power grid, was simply not relevant to the question she had asked. He stayed for a moment, then he moved on. He found Dara Ose in the forward engineering bay. She was not working. She was standing still, which was the first time he had seen her do that. She was looking out a small viewport at the collapsed star in the center of the dead zone. The dim, heavy light of it, the flatness of the space around it. She is stable, Sorvan said. Good, Dara said. The repairs will hold until we reach the nearest station. Good. He stood beside her. Outside, the dead zone was as flat and unremarkable as it had always been. The collapsed star turned its slow, heavy light on the ships clustered around the Aethan's Grace. 4 human vessels, none of them large, none of them built for this, all of them here. Why did you come? He asked. Dara did not look at him. She kept looking at the star. There was a long pause that did not feel uncomfortable. It felt like the pause before an honest answer rather than the pause before a constructed one. You called, she said. She said it the way you say something that is simply true. Not heroically, not with weight or drama, just you called. As if that were the beginning and middle and end of any possible explanation. Sorvan stood beside her and said nothing for a while. Outside, the Marta Jean rested against the Perni. Aethan's Grace. The magnetic clamps holding them together in the flat, strange dark and the oxygen on the Velthari ship kept climbing, and 4 Zuzan people in the lower decks took deeper breaths without knowing why, without knowing that somewhere above them a human woman had fixed an unfixable thing with the wrong tools because someone had called and she had come. The tow formation had no official name. It wasn't in any manual. No protocol existed for it. The 4 human ships had worked it out on the open channel in about 12 minutes. The Marta Jean. On the port bow, the Port Remy. On the starboard, the ESN Kessler. Running point, the St. Agatha. Trailing with her medical team still aboard, and the result was something that looked, on the navigation display, like a hand cupped around something fragile. Aethan's Grace. Sat in the center of it, being carried. It would take 18 hours to reach the nearest station at the speed the tow formation could manage. 18 hours of careful, coordinated, flying through the edge of the dead zone and then out of it, and then across the outer rim shipping lanes to Velthari Station Orith. 18 hours of the Kessler. Its navigation team talking to Priya on the Marta Jean, and to the Port Remy. Its pilot. A man named Arav Singh who had been doing outer rim hauls for 30 years and knew these lanes the way a person knows their own hands, and all of them together holding the Aethan's Grace. On a line toward somewhere safe. Sorvan had been on ships for 290 years. He had never been a passenger before. He sat in the command bay, and he was a passenger, and he did not know what to do with his hands. Vane noticed. She brought him something warm. A drink from the Velthari crew kitchen. Something with herbs from the colony stores they'd been carrying for the new settlement. He accepted it. He held it. He did not drink it immediately, because drinking it would give him something to do with his hands. And he felt, obscurely, that he should sit with the discomfort. He had put his ship and his people into the hands of strangers. The strangers were keeping them alive. These were facts. He sat with them at hour 4 of the tow. He went to find the human captain. Dara Ose was in the Aethan's Grace. Forward galley, which one of the Velthari crew had opened to the human visitors. An unusual gesture, because Velthari community spaces were private, but the circumstances had apparently moved someone to reconsider. She was sitting across a low table from 2 of Sorvan's senior crew members, and there were cups between them, and someone had placed a Velthari navigation chart on the table, and they were looking at it together. Not for any emergency reason, just looking. Sorvan sat down. The dead zone configuration, Dara said. Noticing him, she pointed at the chart. Your people know it better than our databases do. Priya's been getting updated readings from your nav station. Yes, Sorvan said. I authorized that exchange. Good thinking on your end. She picked up her cup. Thank you, he sat. He looked at the chart. He thought about what he wanted to say and then decided to simply say it. We debated for 3 hours, he said, before we sent the signal. Dara looked at him, the council. Whether to send the distress beacon. There were arguments. He paused. There are always arguments among the Velthari when something unprecedented is being considered. We are a deliberate people. We examine from all sides. It took 3 hours to reach the authorization. Dara was quiet for a moment. 3 hours, she said. Yes, we were 3 hours away from you when the signal came. Sorvan looked at her. She was not saying it to wound him. Her voice had no accusation in it. She was simply saying the fact, the pure, clean, terrible mathematics of it. The Velthari had spent 3 hours deciding whether to ask for help. The help had been 3 hours away. I know, he said. Your oxygen window was 14 hours. Yes, she did not push it further. She did not need to. The numbers did it for her. He sat with them. Why does it cost so much? She asked then. Not unkindly, genuinely asking. For your people, asking. Sorvan considered the question. He was 340 years old, and he had spent considerable time over those years thinking about what it meant to be Velthari, what the shape of his people was, what they were proud of, and what the pride cost them. He was not certain he had a simple answer. He was not certain there was one. We are old, he said finally. We have been a spacefaring species for 600 years. We have solved very large problems. We have crossed very great distances. We built things that persist. He turned the cup in his hands. When you have done that, when your history is full of those things, the idea of not being able to do a thing becomes complicated. It is not shame, exactly. It is more like a wrongness, an inconsistency with what we understand ourselves to be. Dara was quiet. It must be easier, he said, for a younger species to ask. I don't know if it's easier, she said. We just do it. Yes, Sorvan said. You do. Outside the galley porthole, the ESN Kessler ran point ahead of them, her running lights steady in the dark. He watched them for a moment. My people, he said slowly, believed certain things about humans, about your species, before today. I know they've... You do not take offense? We've been scary, Dara said. Historically, we know. Pause. But we've gotten mostly oddly, we're working on it. Sorvan almost smiled, almost. He was not sure his face did that. The Velthari had a different range of facial expressions, fewer of them and more controlled, but something in him came close to it. Our elder, Rivan, who is 300 years old, said to me this morning, they are nothing like what we were told. He looked at her. She meant it as high praise. She has not said that about any species in my lifetime. Dara turned her cup in her hands. Tell her we're still working on the scary parts, she said, but thank her. At hour 7, Kwame Asante was in the lower decks with the St. Agatha, his medical team doing dehydration checks on the passengers who had been most affected by the oxygen thinning. The work was methodical and slow, and exactly the kind of work that looked like nothing from the outside. Checking levels, administering fluids, making notes, making sure. But that was, in practice, the difference between people who would land at the station healthy and people who wouldn't. He moved through the rows of Velthari families with his scanner and his quiet manner and his complete uncomplicated attention. He treated a small child's dehydration. He treated an elderly Velthari man's oxygen headache with something from his kit that he wasn't certain would work, and that worked anyway. He treated a woman who had been sitting very still for 2 days conserving air, and whose blood pressure was doing something he needed to monitor. He didn't think about whether he had the authority to be here. He didn't think about the biological differences or the diplomatic implications, or the fact that he was a human medic working on alien patients with improvised protocols. He thought about, this person needs this, I have this, that's the end of the analysis. A Velthari elder, not Sorvan, a different one, a very old woman with the kind of stillness that comes from outliving most of the things you were afraid of. Watched him work for a long time. Then she said something in Velthari that nobody translated for him. Later, he asked Sorvan what she had said. Sorvan was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, you move like someone who has done this before. Not the medicine, the choosing to be here. Kwame thought about that. We all have reasons, he said, for the choosing. What is yours? Kwame was quiet then. My grandmother was a nurse in a place where there wasn't enough of anything. Not enough medicine, not enough facilities, not enough help. She spent 40 years doing what she could with what she had. He looked at his scanner. She told me, you don't wait for the perfect situation. You go where you're needed and you do what you can do. Sorvan said nothing. She's been gone 15 years, Kwame said, but she's here with me. At hour 12, Tomas Race was in the Athens Grace, his engine bay doing things that were definitely not his job. Not because anyone asked him to. He had finished the power coupling repair 4 hours ago, and the Kessler, his damage control team, had taken over the structural work. He was here because he had looked at the Athens Grace, his main thruster array, the thing that had failed and caused all of this, and had seen something. Not a fix. The array was beyond fixing on the fly. But he had seen why it had failed. A cascade from a microfracture in the primary fuel line, which had put stress on the intake manifold, which had communicated that stress upward through the system until the whole thing had seized. He wrote it up. A full failure report, annotated, with what he would check first on a maintenance cycle and what parts would prevent the failure recurring. 4 pages. He gave it to the Athens Grace chief engineer, who read it with the expression of someone receiving an unexpected gift and not being certain of the protocol for accepting it. You did not have to do this, the engineer said. I was here, Tomas said. Shrugged. I saw it. Might as well write it down. The engineer looked at the report for a moment. Our standard maintenance logs did not catch this. No, it's subtle. You'd need to know what to look for. He pointed at a page. This is what to look for. He went back to Marta Jean to sleep. At hour 15, Priya Nair was teaching a Velthari navigation officer a card game. She had not planned to do this. She had been on the Marta Jean's bridge running tow formation calculations when a young Velthari officer, clearly not on duty, clearly restless, clearly trying very hard not to look like he was watching the human navigator work, had edged closer to the console and, after about 10 minutes of edging, asked what she was doing. She had explained. He had asked more questions. She had answered more questions. Then the tow calculations were done and updated, and the course was locked, and there was a period of waiting, and she had, without really deciding to, pulled out the battered deck of cards she kept in her uniform pocket. It was a game she had learned from her father, who had learned it from his, going back several generations to a coastal city in a country that had looked different then. It had no particular strategic value. It was the kind of game you played when you wanted company. She taught it to a Velthari navigation officer 9 hours from a dead zone in the outer rim. He was a fast learner. He beat her in the 3rd round. You cheated, she said. He said something she couldn't translate. Okay, fine, she said. Rematch. Sorvan found Dara again at hour 16. She was alone in the forward engineering bay where she had been before, in the same spot, looking at the same collapsed star growing smaller behind them as the tow formation moved away from it. He stood beside her. We are 6 hours out, he said. I know. The oxygen levels are stable. The structural repairs will hold. Good. They stood in the quiet together. This Marta Jean was visible through the viewport, a small ship against the dark, running with them, holding the line. May I ask, Sorvan said, what made you answer so quickly? Your crew, your ship, without consultation, without assessment. Dara was quiet for a long time, long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, still looking at the shrinking star, my brother's name was Marcus. He was 24 years old. His ship sent a distress signal 7 years ago. She stopped. Nobody came in time. Sorvan said nothing. 3 ships could have reached him. They didn't divert. Her voice was very level. I don't know why. Maybe the math didn't work out for them. Maybe they had cargo they couldn't dump. Maybe she stopped again. It doesn't matter why. No, Sorvan said. I suppose it does not. I've been flying the outer rim since then. I muted every channel that isn't required. She paused, except that one. I never muted that one. The Galactic Emergency Band. She had kept it open for 7 years, waiting for the call that she could answer. Sorvan stood in the silence of that. He stood in it the way you stand in something that is too large to respond to with words, so you do not try. You stand in it. You let it be the size it is. I am sorry, he said at last, about your brother. Dara didn't move, I know, she said. She said it like she meant it, outside. Marmata Jane ran steady alongside them, engine at 140%, engine that should not have survived this, surviving this because Tomas kept his hands on it and because ships, the good ones, the old ones, the ones built when people still made things to last, sometimes exceeded what was possible when the person asking them to was someone they trusted. 6 hours. Sorvan went back to the command bay. He sat in his chair. He thought about 3 hours of debate and what those 3 hours had cost, and about a human woman who kept one channel open for 7 years because she understood, without being taught, without being told, without needing it explained, that the call was the thing, that if the call came you answered it. He thought about his people. 600 years of being capable. 600 years of solving their own problems. 600 years of pride that had calcified somewhere along the way into the inability to do the thing that a 24-year-old human engineer had apparently understood without trying. That needing help is not the end of dignity, it is just needing help. And help, if you were lucky, came. Vane looked at him from her console. She had the expression she always had when she was not saying something. Say it, Sorvan said. She hesitated. Then, I am glad we sent the signal. Yes, Sorvan said. So am I. Outside, the stars of the outer rim passed by them, steady and indifferent and very beautiful. And 4 human ships carried the Athens Grace towards somewhere safe. Velthari Station Orith was not a quiet place on an ordinary day. Today was not an ordinary day. The station's docking authority had cleared a full arrival bay. Not a standard cargo berth, not a transit slip, a full arrival bay, the kind normally reserved for diplomatic vessels or emergency medical situations. And what came through it was not what the docking controllers had expected. They had expected Athens Grace. She came in at the center, as expected, moving slowly under the guidance of the tow formation. What they had not expected was the 4 human ships wrapped around her like a hand. The controllers watched on the station's external cameras. They noted the formation. They noted that it was not a protocol they had in any file. They noted that the Athens Grace, a colony ship they had been watching on the emergency frequency for 24 hours, was intact, was pressurized, was arriving with everyone alive. They cleared all 4 human ships for dock. The arrivals took 40 minutes. Athens Grace came first, guided in by the patient cooperation of the Marta Jeanne and the Auguste Port Remy, until her own docking systems could take over. The human ships came in behind her one at a time. ESN Kessler. Last, the point ship staying on point until there was no longer any point to run. Sorvan stood at the Athens Grace's main airlock as his people disembarked. 4,000 of them. He counted them without meaning to. He was a navigator. Counting was in him the way breathing was in him. He counted the families with their bundles and their children and their tired faces. He counted the elderly being helped by the young. He counted the children who ran because children always run when a crisis ends and the legs remember what they are for. He counted them and they were all there, all of them. The same number they had been when the ship left the last colony port, because 4 human ships had come out of the dark and brought the number back from the edge of something else entirely. The Velthari did not make ceremonies of things like this. They had no tradition of public gratitude, no speeches, no gathered crowds. People arrived and people were counted and the emergency was closed. But there were people watching. They had been watching since the distress signal went out. Not the Velthari, not here on the station, but across the outer rim and into the mid-sectors and along the shipping lanes where ships of 6 different species had been monitoring the galactic emergency band as all ships did. They had watched a human cargo freighter respond in 11 minutes. They had watched 3 more human ships divert without authorization from anyone. They had watched the formation on the approach cameras and they had watched the Athens Grace arrive intact. 6 diplomatic representatives were present on Orath when the ships arrived, not because they had been called, because they had come on their own, quietly, without announcement, to see with their eyes the thing they had been watching on their screens. The Keth ambassador, a species that had received the signal and sent a query to Central Command for authorization and received the authorization 22 hours later, stood at the observation window and Marta Jeanne come into dock and said nothing to his aide, who also said nothing. The Praxin Fleet liaison, who had logged the distress call and marked it for review, stood 3 windows down. The Duran Cooperative's representative, who had sent back a clarifying query that was never answered because the situation had been resolved before it was relevant, stood at the back of the room. They had all responded in some way. None of them had come. They watched the humans dock. In the arrival bay, the first thing that happened was practical. Medical teams from the station met the St. Agatha's medics at the airlock and there was a brief, efficient handoff of patient notes, not formal, not ceremonial, just one medic talking to another medic about what had been done and what still needed watching. Kwame Asante stood in the middle of it and answered questions from station doctors and made sure nothing was missed. The Kessler's damage control crew filed out looking tired in the specific way of people who have been doing hard physical work for many hours, satisfied and depleted in equal measure. The lieutenant who commanded the cutter, 22 years old, his first solo command, a very young face on a very composed expression, filed his arrival report with the station docking authority and found out, 3 days later when the commendation request from the Velthari government came through, that people had been watching. He was eating a sandwich when the notification came. He read it twice. Then he finished his sandwich. Dara stood at Marta Jeanne's airlock with Priya and Tomas and Kwame and watched the Athens Grace finish disembarking her people. The 4 of them stood together in the dock without saying much. This was their way. Not much ceremony. Not much announcement. They had done a thing. The thing was done. There would be paperwork and there would be the question of the contract. And there would be a maintenance cycle that the Marta Jean badly needed after what they had asked of her engine. But right now they just stood and watched. Sorvan came to them. He walked from the Pramicalate. Athens Grace. His airlock across the dock, a long walk. Not because the dock was that large, but because every step of it felt deliberate. He walked like a man who has made a decision and is enacting it. He stopped in front of Dara. He was holding something. Not large, a flat disc, silver blue, with markings on it that were clearly significant in a way that Dara didn't understand. He held it in both hands, which seemed like it was the proper way to offer it. "This is a navigator's emblem," he said. "The emblem of my rank, my office." Dara looked at it. "Okay," she said carefully. "In Velthari culture," he said, "this object is not given. It is held until the holder dies, and then it is retired. It is not a gift. It is not a decoration." He paused. He was choosing the next words with the kind of care he gave to navigation. "It is the word. I would go into the dark for you." There was a silence. Priya very quietly said something to Dara. She had looked it up. Priya always looked things up. She said it very quietly, just for Dara. "It means he'd fly into the dead zone for you." Dara looked at the emblem, then at Sorvan. She did not say anything for a moment. She was a person who was economical with words in the same way she was economical with explanations, and she was searching for the right words the way she navigated in a dead zone, carefully, by feel, trusting the small things. "Tell me how to hold it right," she said. Sorvan showed her. Both hands she held it. "I'll carry it," she said. "I mean that." Sorvan looked at her. "I know," he said. "The way you say something when you simply believe it." Behind them, across the dock, a Velthari child. The same girl who had pressed her face against the porthole in the dark of the dead zone. The one who had followed Tomas through the engine bay. Ran past and then stopped when she saw Tomas. She said something at him in rapid Velthari. He didn't understand it. He looked at Priya. "She says the thing you told her about the cups and the water was wrong," Priya translated, with a small smile. "She says she looked it up," grinned. It was a very large grin on a very tired face. "Tell her she's right," I simplified. Priya translated. The child said something back. Priya laughed. "She says you should have told her the real version. She would have understood." "Tell her next time," Tomas said. "I'll tell her the real version." The child ran off. Tomas looked at Dara. "Invoke them yet?" "Working on it. We lost 2 million in polymer." "I know. Just checking." The invoice arrived at the Velthari Commercial Authority 3 days later, sent by Tomas, because he had found it funny to actually send it and had done so with the same careful attention to detail he gave to engine maintenance. Line items, quantities, the cost of the polymer, the cost of the fuel, a line for miscellaneous engine wear, extended high output operation. He priced conservatively. He framed the copy he kept. The Velthari Commercial Authority processed the payment in full within the hour of receipt. Double value, no negotiation, no questions. An attached note that read in very formal Velthari, something that Priya translated as, "The debt owed cannot be valued in commerce, but commerce is the mechanism we have. Please accept this as a beginning." Tomas looked at the payment notification for a long time. He did not say anything about the engine wear line item being conservative. Somewhere in the observation gallery above the arrival bay, the 6 diplomatic representatives had watched all of it. They had watched the emblem. They had watched the child and the engineer. They had watched the 4 tired humans from 4 battered ships standing in a dock on a Velthari station, after doing a thing that nobody had asked them to do, and nobody had paid them to do, and that they had done anyway, in 11 minutes, because someone had called. The Keth ambassador turned to his aide. "Draft a message to our ships," he said. "I want a review of our emergency response protocols." His aide nodded and made a note. The Praxan fleet liaison was already composing something on his personal console. The Duran representative was quiet for a long time, and then said something to no one in particular that his translator rendered as, "We should have come." He did not say it regretfully. He said it like a person who has learned something true. Marta Jean departed Orith Station 2 days later after a maintenance cycle that Tomas supervised personally, and that took twice as long as scheduled because the engine had opinions about what it had been through, and he respected those opinions and addressed every single one. They had a new cargo contract, a delivery run to a mid-rim refinery station, standard polymers, nothing unusual. The outer rim lanes in autumn were clear and cold and very beautiful in the way that deep space was beautiful when you were flying through it in a ship that worked and with people you trusted and toward somewhere specific. Dara had the navigator's emblem on the console so beside her chair. She had found a small mounting clip, Priya had made it from a spare bracket, shaped to hold the disc at an angle where Dara could see it from the captain's chair without having to look away from the screens. She looked at it sometimes, not often, just enough, at the far edge of the mapped galaxy, further out than Orith Station, further out than the outer rim shipping lanes, in the unmapped space where the stars were different and the distances between things were so large that they stopped feeling like distances and started feeling like silence. There was a ship, not a human ship, not Velthari, a species that had no name in any human database because they had not yet made contact with anyone. Small ship, not built for deep space. Exactly, built for their own system's travel, pushed further by necessity, by the particular pressure that made species leave the safety of the familiar and go out into the not yet known. Something was wrong with the ship. They had been drifting for 6 days. The crew, there were 11 of them, a small number, a family-sized number, the kind of crew that was also a community, had done everything they could do and had reached the end of what they could do. And now they were sitting in the silence of a ship that was not going to solve this on its own. They had something, a device, taken from wreckage they'd passed years ago, old wreckage, strange materials, from a species they'd never identified. The device had a frequency. They had never used it. They didn't know what it was for. It had been in their ship's storage for 4 years, like a question they hadn't asked yet. They asked it. They activated the beacon. The response came in 9 minutes. Not from the nearest ship, not from the most capable ship, from the closest human vessel, a survey craft called the ESN Alvarado. Running a mapping sweep of the unmapped edge, 9 words came back. Copy that, we're coming, hold on. Tan Park. The crew of the small ship did not know what the words meant. They did not speak the language. Their translation systems worked on it for 2 minutes and produced something approximate. Something about the direction of travel. Something about continuing. Something that felt, even through the bad translation, like the same thing. Don't die, we're coming. You're not alone. They pressed their hands against their portholes and watched the stars and waited. The ESN Alvarado was 9 hours out. She came in 7. They didn't know much about humans out there on the edge of everything. But they knew one thing. You called, and the humans came.